So welcome to our podcast, Workplace Stories from the People Experience Hub, where today I'm joined by Gethin Nadin, author, psychologist, Chief Innovation Officer for Zealous and Benefex, who's joining me today to talk about building business cases and the return on investment on creating a world of good. This is for salespeople, it's for HR people. There's going to be so much value for this. Enjoy. Hi everyone, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the People Experience podcast, where I'm delighted to be joined by Gethin. Welcome, Gethin.
Hello, how are you?
Really good, thank you. And as ever, I am delighted. I think you were the first person I ever had on a webinar or a podcast back in the day, and here we are again today. So I'm delighted to be joined by you.
Let's see if I still know what I'm talking about, or if I ever did.
We'll get there. So this podcast is called The Return on Investment of Creating a World of Good, How People-Centric Strategies Drive Business Success. But we're going to start with a little bit about yourself. So helping people understand you and your journey. So you've had a fascinating journey across psychology, HR tech, and thought leadership. Can you share a little bit about what has shaped your career and your current focus?
Yeah, so well, first of all, thanks for having me back. I guess like all those who end up in this type of role, I've experienced the kind of very best, but also the very worst of workplaces. I've been mistreated at work and have seen firsthand how impactful that negative employee experience can be. I think a bad boss runs through your life like a thread you can pull on at 80 years old and remember what it was like to be treated the way you were 60 years before that. But I also believe that workplaces can be a really profound force for good in people's lives. I think good employers drive fairly significant social change, and at the moment, in a way we haven't seen before. And I think we should be celebrating those at that progressive end of that type of workplace and maybe shaming those at the bottom. So, I guess fundamentally for me, I think it's that thinking that has shaped most of my work. But as I progressed my career, I also realized that none of this positive effort came at a cost to the employer. In fact, they went hand in hand. I think one of the first things I ever wrote in a LinkedIn blog was about caring and kind workplaces. And those kind, caring, supportive employers were also some of the most successful. And so it paid dividends literally to be the kind of employer that put people first. And I think the more that I believed in that, the more I wanted to make sure that others did too. But as time went on, I started to see that most employers didn't really know what made a great employee experience. They didn't know how to look after the well-being of their people. They didn't know how important HR tech was, employee benefits or recognition tools were. And they didn't understand how that wasn't just about the culture of the organizations, but the very definition of their success. And so that's really how my first and second books came along. And I guess the rest is history. And I think my strong connection to the business world met my desire to do right by people and create this world of good of my own. And the thought leader stuff I think is interesting because I don't think you can ever set out to be a thought leader or to be considered an expert. You also can't self-proclaim yourself to be either of those, although plenty of people do. I think if you set yourself a target to make a difference in the industry you work in, you try to affect and influence change, and if you're lucky, you'll get called one of those things. Um, I get eternally annoyed by the volume of messages from people on social who ask me, "How can I do what you do?" They just want the status. They want to speak on stage and have people
Mhm.
listen, but it doesn't start like that. You do the work, and then if you're worthwhile and if you're lucky, someone will give you a stage to stand on, or even better, an award that says you're a thought leader. But that's kind of up to other people to determine. So, yeah, that's kind of where I think I am and where I started.
I think it's a great point because like it's even the thought leader stuff. It reminds me of that I met I met a lady called Dr. Hannah Gore, who works in HR. She's worked across L&D, HR, and I remember meeting her. We had a good conversation. We're just chatting about stuff sitting in Oxford, a little coffee shop in Oxford, and I remember proclaiming something along the lines of, "Well, I'm a good guy." And she went, "Well, let me just stop you there. Like, you don't get to self-proclaim that you're a good guy. You know, good guy
Yeah.
is what other people will let you know you are, or through the lens that they're experiencing you, or the lens that they're interacting with you, they get to tell you you're a good guy. You don't get to tell the world you're a good guy. It's almost the definition of like gaslighting before you even started. So I'm a thought leader. You don't get to do that. You are told, you helped me think differently. And I think that's a really good point. And I'm interested because you've written quite extensively about well-being. Like, how did that become central to your work?
Yeah, so it was in my first book, A World of Good, that's when I started to notice the pretty profound impact that well-being was having on employment. I was working with lots of employers back in kind of 2015, 2014, consulting and advising, and I felt like I needed a richer understanding of, at the time, the benefits industry and kind of what made up a great employee value proposition and that kind of stuff. And almost like a good salesperson might feel like they could sell more Mercedes if they understood what was under the engine. I kind of felt like I wanted to understand the industry in a bit more depth. And so that's what I did. I started talking to hundreds of employees globally about their employee experience. I read what little books were out at the time on employee experience, watched the YouTube talks, read the blogs, read the research, and the biggest learning really came from seeing all those employers and what they were doing, and most importantly, what they didn't know and what they were doing wrong. They weren't following the latest research, they weren't learning from each other's experiences, and I was really interested in why that was, what was preventing them creating a great experience, and what did those different types of workers want from work. And as I started to explore that deeper and deeper and write the first book, of which you were in, you were actually in both of my books. I then started to see this very thick line of well-being through all of that, and I realized in that first book that when I spoke about a great employee experience, I was actually almost always talking about a great well-being experience. And I was able to link the research in well-being to recognition, to belonging, to job crafting, leadership, comms, workload, purpose, community, all that stuff that was kind of employee engagement and then also employee experience. That was all well-being too. And but the problem I think then happened was as the well-being industry bloomed, we were being sold a pretty false promise of what well-being was, and the market was full of snake oil and cowboys. And I wanted to make sure that employers knew what the right advice was and who they should be listening to and trusting, and what evidence they should be building themselves. And that also then became a central mission for me for many years. And the crux of what I've done a lot in my career, especially over the last 10 years, was how do we create workplaces and cultures that serve the well-being of people so that we can create a more economically successful country with strong positive employment, where organizations that see a real value for them in caring for their people, who fully understand that their successful route to profitability, shareholder return, customer loyalty, all that stuff was paved with well employees who feel cared for and appreciated. Um, but the latter, I think, what we'll talk about today, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to do. I think boards are getting far more discerning in what they invest in
Mm.
and how that investment produces returns for the company. And when it comes to well-being, especially, the right thing to do is just not enough to get employers to spend money on the kind of things that Benefit Excel or the PX Hub sell or any other people in the industry. And it's becoming a harder conversation to have, which is kind of not why you should care, but why should the people outside of that buying team care about this stuff as well?
There's a really good cartoon that I share it on a regular basis by a cartoonist called War and Peace. Spelled peas. Four box grid, and the top one is somebody talking at a conference that says people who are well in organization, it's your moral duty to do that. Silence is the next one. And then the next slide is, or the next box is, and people who are well are 15 times more productive. And then it's got a boss leaning over to somebody going, write that one down, write that one. And it does feel like that, doesn't it? And I guess before we get
Yeah.
onto the return on investment, like thinking about HR professionals or people in like adjacent industries, supporting industries that say, do you know what? I do look at what Gethin's doing and I would love to be where you are. You've already said, well, look, you've got to do the work. Like, I've already heard you talking about curiosity and interest in the things around you, understanding that fierce curiosity to lift the lid. What's going on in here? How can I understand that so that I can be better in my adjacent role or in my core role and understand it? Is there anything else that you would give to somebody right now around that advice to do something where they almost follow in your footsteps?
I think you've got to do the work, and then the influence and will come if you're any good at that. If you're saying stuff that's interesting, if you're challenging people in the right way, I remember seeing a BBC producer years and years ago talking about what made a great television presenter. And it was at the time where the BBC was saying, we don't hire presenters, we're trying to hire experts in their field that can also do presenting. And the one they talked about was David Dickinson. And I've got a bit of a tan today, so I'll liken myself to David Dickinson for a moment. They got someone who knew antiques and had a decades worth of antique experience, but also had a personality that would fit television. Um, and it always resonated with me that that felt like the sensible way around, right? Having a sports pundit that's actually played the sport they're talking about kind of makes sense. And so um, somebody asked me the other day, a 23-year-old guy, I had a call with him and he basically said, I want to do what you do. How do I get there? And I was like, what do you want me to tell you? Like, do it for 20 years and write two best-selling books and get a fellowship, and then maybe you'll have a shot. Like, there's no shortcut to this. You have to
Mm,
start with that resolution to I want to make a difference. I want to work at the coalface. I'm not in HR, but almost every day I spend time with HR teams and they tell me about their problems and I help them try and solutionize. So when you're at that coalface and you witness the industry kind of at the shop floor, if you like, um, then that starts to give you the ammo that builds your awareness. You do your own research, you kind of get ingrained in the industry, and then that all gives you the ability to form an informed opinion and an evidence-based opinion. And I think that is where you then start to get people's attention. I mean, the reality is no one's going to listen to this 20-year-old guy who's straight out of a sports psychology degree um, to talk to the HR space. Like, I think our industry is full of a lot of people that are not worth speaking about. And I know that seems not worth listening to. I know it sounds probably really arrogant, but who stands on stage and is giving you advice, their pedigree, their integrity, and their background is a really important part of why you should listen to them. Nobody wants to go to a conference and see a salesperson tell you about a product, but somebody wants to hear a industry expert talk about how that product solved problems for people. And so
mhm.
I think that's what people need to do is you do the work and you'll get enough knowledge then that you've got something to say on stage that's worth listening to.
I love that. And I'm going to throw something in as well, I guess, which is let's make sure this isn't like a love-in at all, but like I'm going to throw something in which is about generosity of time. And I can think of plenty of times on my own journey where I've picked up the phone to you, I've dropped you a WhatsApp, an email, and just said, I'm thinking about something and I need to share it. I need to talk to somebody. This is what I'm thinking about. Or could you look at this? Does it read right? And like, and actually, that generosity of time as well starts generosity of, um, I think well of you. I know that you're somebody that I would go to. If you don't know the answer, you don't guess. And it's that stuff as well that I'd probably throw in there.
But
And
but but it works both ways, right? My first book did a whole chapter on networking and how important that was. One of the early deals I signed at Benefex, a large £1 million plus deal that maybe even changed the course of us of a startup at the time. I think our CEO will probably agree that it did. That happened because I reached out for a coffee with somebody, and that started that ball rolling. That changed life for me, and maybe changed the future direction of Benefex. Networking is a really, really important part of any industry, and having a having people around you that will champion what you do is what will help you be successful. So I've tried to never lose that, no matter how busy I am. Having two phone calls today with people that I'm too busy to have phone calls to, but they needed help, and my natural inclination is to help people when they ask for it. Um, and there's the awards behind me and all the kind of stuff I've achieved. That doesn't happen on my own. I don't believe any man is an
mm,
island. You were a huge supporter of the first book, like significant. I remember you sent me a WhatsApp and I got really emotional. You took loads of my books to a conference. I think it was the first festival of work and gave
oh
them
yeah,
away. And for someone who self-published the first book, that's massive, right? Because you're taking a book to a conference that I couldn't have afforded to do and getting that into people's hands. And you've supported that many, many times and the second book. And so I'm clearly going to be here. And anytime you're like, do you need help with anything? You click your fingers and I'm going to jump. But you have to be like that in this industry. And I think if you want to be a good thought leader or expert as well, I think that certainly is a feature of the best people I know. And, many of the people you've had on this podcast are exactly the same. They're people who've really helped me out with my career, and hopefully I've helped theirs as well.
so break down walls, ignore those barriers that maybe we're competitors or we're competing for the same space, move all that stuff. I love that. So let's get into what this is about, return on investment. And you're absolutely right. So as a business, we're seeing it more now than we did in 2019, for example, or even 2021. We're seeing a more critical approach to what we buy and when we buy and why we buy. And that view of isn't an unkind view, it isn't a non-human view, which is treating our people well is only we only do that when there is a clear return on investment, but it's about can you still demonstrate the return on investment so that we can have a broader conversation about this. So I guess starting that, like we'll focus on what you've been doing. So you've been exploring the ROI of well-being, employee benefits, HR tech. What are some of the most compelling links that you found between the investments that in those and company success?
So to frame what I'm going about to say in this answer, I ran a couple of sessions last year, which I called kind of value enhancing HR, and they were two HR teams at two very large global employers. So I was presenting to hundreds of their HR teams. One was a big defense employer, one was a large healthcare employer, and these kind of talks are in demand because the people functions changed a lot, I think, in a few short years. And many people working in HR, I think, maybe lost their way a little bit. Their roles changed since the pandemic, and HR changed because the world changed. But we realized that HR and people operations needed to not just be at the table, but be embedded throughout the organization. And that's a really important part of kind of if we're looking at our ROI of well-being or HR tech or whatever it might be, we have to look at how HR can become more value enhancing by showing its various stakeholders just how impactful it is or can be. And I'll read some of these off, but we can link some of the most common features of a modern people team to some pretty significant improvements in organizational outcomes. So I'll just read some of these off. So quality onboarding will generate 3.5 times more revenue growth. Employee engagement will lead to 23% higher profitability. Benefit schemes lead to 25% higher performance. HR-led training programs lead to a 218% higher income per employee than those without HR-led training programs. Stronger HR practices experience 40% fewer legal disputes. Employee well-being, we know we can directly link to high performance. Consistent HR communications lead to a 21% boost in productivity. Where HR helps align their work to that of organizations' strategic objectives, they become 42% more likely to achieve those objectives. Well-structured reward schemes increase productivity by 44%. If you just look at kind of two things in my world, kind of well-being and employee benefits, we also see that stuff come through, which is basically linking, we're taking something out of the team it operates in and starting to talk about it from a much wider organizational level. So I did something similar to the value enhancing HR, which is called the Health Hextad. So I analyzed 30 years worth of research to show how improving employee well-being leads to better outcomes for employers. Um, we looked at the largest analysis of employee sentiment in history, which indicated this pretty significant link between employee well-being and overall firm performance. We found that employee well-being correlated directly with higher corporate valuations and consumer views of that brand. We know during economically challenging times, the relationship between individual employee well-being and company performance was heightened. And data from over 1,600 listed companies reveals a statistically significant relationship between well-being and profitability. So again, this like 30 years of data show us a direct correlation between total shareholder return, profitability, higher employee well-being, all that kind of stuff directly correlates. But I would question how many employers know this stuff. How many CEOs
Mm-hmm.
get proposals from HR, reward, or benefit teams that cite studies like that? I think the vast majority of, I think if you look at this, Willis Towers Watson, I think it was, did some research earlier this year and found the vast majority of spend proposals get rejected by boards because the business case isn't strong enough. And that shouldn't be
Yeah,
happening. It was basically two-thirds of proposals that are put from HR teams to the board never go anywhere. Um,
that's
and so I've
incredible.
been, yeah, it's massive. And I've been doing the same thing recently because these teams look at, I mean, you must get it with surveys. The team are looking at how does this help HR? How does this help the people team? What admin reduction do we see? What cost reduction do we see? And by the time that gets to the CFO or the CEO or whoever, how excited are they about, oh, will we make your little team a little bit more productive? Does the business really care about that? I think that's a harsh truth. But the business cares about sales and innovation and collaboration and lower turnover and higher customer NPS score. So how do you kind of link what you're trying to do to all those things that tend to exist in most business strategies? Um, I even did the same recently for employee benefits, and I took that and debuted that research at Silicon Valley a few months ago. And I was looking at, in that example, what I called a high impact global benefits architecture. And so again, I got to that result by looking at the profitability of 20 companies listed on the National Stock Exchange over 10 years. And I found a significant relationship between employee benefit costs and then that firm's profits after tax and return on equity, even allowing for the costs associated with rolling out a global benefits technology. So we could link global benefits technology as driving profits and lowering costs or controlling costs. That one study, we found that investments in employee benefits technology impacted firm performance in kind of several pretty compelling ways. Um, and similar studies, we looked at other stuff that was looking at kind of metrics over a 4-year period and found that high quality employee benefit schemes generate a 1.4% higher market performance than employers without employee benefit schemes. So we found all these things where we were linking in reward and benefits. Historically, the team that we were in were looking at how does it reduce admin, how does it reduce calls to our shared contact center or our HR team, how do we get people to choose more benefits. We were looking at how do you make that team's measures of success get greater or be improved. We were never looking at how does the company get better because of these things. Um, and how often, I mean, I've rarely seen a proposal for employee benefits talking about impact on overall business goals. They tend to be focused on admin reduction, engagement boost. But like many HR functions, they become a bit too inverted and look at solving their own problems, not that kind of HR outreach, which is how do I use this thing to solve the needs of this stakeholder over here or the business at large. And I think that's a really, really important part that's been missing from those business cases and the return on investment calculations that most of my focus this year has been on because that's something I think we can make a big difference.
I'm just like, wow, I've heard so much and I hear all of that because I mean, we see it as a supplier, as a partner to
Yeah.
organizations when we're talking to people. We see that the classic return on investment model is one of retention, is about the cost of retention, because that's easy data to get a hold of in the HR sphere when we don't break the silo. And we see that actually, if we can reduce your retention numbers by X, it will save you Y, and we'll only cost you Z, which is 300%, 500% times return on investment. And it's creating it on a single source of truth rather than looking at stuff like that. And I guess, I mean, I had a question around how can organizations build solid business cases? And I suspect there's a hand in hand. Are you working with a partner or a supplier? Because the supplier's just going to sell you stuff and maybe give you a few sound bites from their suppliers, but from their clients. But if you are in the business, you're evidence based, you're critical. What are you looking for here? Longitudinal data? Are you looking for data that's been backed up, that's valid?
So you get taught in higher education to do something called a CRAP test when you're looking at evidence, which is basically you're looking at was that done in the last 10 years? Was the sample size big enough? Kind of these measures of like this study, why is this
Mm.
study particularly worth listening to? Um, and so I think we should start to do that. I think for me, it was analyzing that evidence base and you can what's quite interesting is some of the small criticisms I've had of some of the things I've talked about have been around, but how can you possibly say that employee benefits is driving profitability? And it's like, well, I'm showing you all the research that is suggesting that in those businesses that have this thing in place, but everything else is controlled wherever possible, that business is better. And I was able to even to look at startups with employee benefits example. I was able to look at startups. So if you took a startup and gave it employee benefits, what happens to that startup when compared to others over time? And it actually performs better over time. So even from a blank starting point, you can start to show that there's an impact here. It's not just benefits were not just a correlation of successful businesses, they were drivers of that kind of success. And when I was pulling all this stuff together and I put it in front of one customer turned to me a couple of years ago and said, you provide so much evidence, we have to take your word for it. The only other way we're going to do this is we go away and find counter amount of evidence to disagree with you. And again, I was tested on this recently by a customer, and something I put in front of them had 100 studies quoted. And I said to them, like, what's the number of studies I could provide you from what organizations that will tip the balance? Because if it's 100, if it's not 100 and you're not listening to the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, Harvard University, and all these
Hmm.
others, what's the evidence base that it's ever going to get you to tip the balance to believe what I'm telling you? But even the example that you've said, which we see an awful lot in any kind of HR space, is how do I affect recruitment, retention, absence rates, turnover? Um, we measure those things because it's most things that employers measure. And so you can then start to see that figure come down because you made a decision. Now, you will never, never know whether it was pulling that lever that drove that down.
Yeah.
You could have rolled out a Benefex product, a people experience product, and that figure comes down. But you also could have got rid of a manager that everyone hated, and that's why your turnover kind of reduced a little bit. So you'll never really know exactly. But what you're basically showing, and a customer said this to me recently, is we're pulling all these levers to try to follow the evidence. So if the evidence saying if you pull that lever, you'll get a boost in this figure, we're going along and pulling as many of those we can to get that figure to the best possible place it can be. And does it matter if I can directly attribute that going up to this? If within a time frame I did these things and that figure went up, that's enough for me in the organization to say that was the right decision to make, and we had some influence on that figure going up. Um, so I
I love
think,
this because we had, sorry, just jump in there, but we had a client who on their board was somebody who sat on the medical council for the UK. And when we were talking about some stuff, he was talking about um, research studies, really long studies. And I remember the CEO going, look, I get it. You're in the detail of that stuff. But the reality is, we know in the last 12 months, having worked with this company, we've got better data, been able to make better decisions, and those decisions have translated into better outcomes. You know, whether we can, exactly what you just said, whether we can factually attribute it just to that or to a whole suite of things, we're not here to cure heart attacks. We're here to do business. And actually, it seems like what we've done in the last 12 months is made some good decisions, got some good data, and moved forward on it. And I'm happy that in the mix, this is good. So once you're in,
yeah,
prove your worth, keep proving your worth.
yeah, 100%. I always call it like, how do we make the boat go faster? So when you're building your business case, you have to show how that investment is going to make your boat go faster. And I think you have to think outside of your team and link that to the aims and goals of your various stakeholders. They are the important people in this decision making, not you. If you can show whether it's employee surveys, whether it's benefits, whether it's well-being, if you're going to people and saying like, what do you need to achieve? And it's a sales director saying, well, we've got a 20% gap in our business, new business sales, we need to sell that more. Then I should be saying, okay, my proposal I'm putting forward because I want to buy something off Gethin or Nick should include how can I get that person's figure to go up with what I'm buying here? How can I demonstrate a link between
Mhm.
those things? How will buying these things, this HR tech, this well-being solution, whatever it is, how will it, in that example, help your sales team sell more? How will it get customer NPS score go up? How will it create more innovation, lead to lower customer calls or a faster production line, kind of whatever the success looked like? And so I think we have to show our stakeholders how those plans are going to grow our organization in the way that it needs to grow. In the benefits example, benefits technology, we now know drives organizational success because it allows employers to do several high value things with their people. So better benefits technology enables organizations to facilitate better benefit choice. Tech in itself means we can deliver more highly personalized benefit experiences. We also help them to make more informed decisions. And similarly with well-being, well-being drives up or driving up, sorry, well-being in your organization helps to create more of these characteristic behaviors of successful organizations. And those behaviors are found in high-performing organizations like more customer-centric values, better brand awareness, customer retention, adaptability, strategic management. And I think HR would be far more successful in this approach. And the most successful HR teams I know, I think, already start to look at, okay, I want to buy this problem to solve this product to solve this problem for me, but how do I actually then link it to
Mhm.
getting good outcomes for those various stakeholders outside of my team and outside of my own strategy?
And and I think it's that whole. as HR, we are facilitating or maybe we're enabling the procurement of this, maybe the implementation of this, but we're not doing it because it's a HR thing. We're doing it because it's a business thing. We're doing
100%.
this for business reasons and people reasons, our ultimate customers, ultimate stakeholders, shareholders, and of course, we are the facilitators of it. No different to our health and safety team ensuring that they facilitate safety and safety training and everything they do, our engineering team facilitating fixing things and something to do with spanners probably.
But I mean, this is how important it is. We come up against it so much, and in the 20 years I've been doing this, we've come up against it so much. I've lectured multiple times to CIPD and HR Masters students on building a business case because I feel like when I interact with HR leaders and reward and benefit and wellbeing leaders who are in their 40s and above, then most people, frankly, are not very good at building these business cases and have never been taught it. HR is not good at HR is not as good as asking for money as marketing and sales are, because marketing and sales have had to say, if I pull this lever, this is how you're going to get X amount more sales. And so that becomes a really easy calculation for the business to understand. I'll give you the budget to buy a sales development representative because you'll demonstrate that you'll get another 15 meetings a week by having that person in place. Um, and HR just doesn't talk in that way. It's one of the reasons why, in part, I got the fellowship at King's Business School, was because we were starting to educate employees on there's some real life stuff here that you're not really getting told by the CIPD or SHRM or whoever it might be, and how do we actually commercially get you to build this? Because you and I both know the more we help customers build a compelling return on investment, the far more likely we are to win them as a customer. But we
Mhm.
need them on board with building this because sometimes our help isn't enough. They need to be doing this themselves. And sometimes their purchase isn't coming to a provider like us. It might just be a change in policy or additional recruitment. And if you want to be more successful at getting money, you've got to start thinking about this in a slightly different way.
I, I I I couldn't agree more because I grew up in retail. I grew up at Tesco, and for an organization, I was there. I joined them when they were number three, and I was still an employee driving a forklift truck when they were number two, when they became number one. And they didn't do that because they accidentally dominated a market. They did that because they made conscious decisions. And one of those conscious decisions was about how we spend money and therefore how we ask for money. And when I became a project manager for the first time, owning product and solutions and had to buy things, it was a really clear rule, which was if you cannot demonstrate a 300% return on investment of your
Yeah.
spend, we will auto decline this unless it is
Yeah.
a compliance need, capability need, or other needs to ensure that we are keeping safe, keeping our customers and employees safe, or something else. So unless it's legislative or anything else, then
Fascinating.
300 times that. So I remember going and spending £1 million on HR technology and having to demonstrate that I could return more than £3 million of this. And, you know, so I came out of that world into the world, and exactly what you just said, I suddenly discovered a world where I said, okay, so it's Monday morning. What did we do last week? Did we hit our KPIs? What were the numbers? Are we on top of everything? Did we miss anything? Did we hit our volume challenge, our distribution challenge? And people were sitting looking at me like I had two heads, like, what, how would we know? And I'm like, how do you not know?
Yeah.
You
But
you
but
must know.
but it's really challenging because especially in the well-being world, so many people say like people come to me with the product they've built. It literally happened today. Somebody pitched me a product and I'm asking them really commercial questions about like how am I going to get the return if we started working with you, kind of what does this look like? And they were just like, this is morally the right thing to do. And I was like, I'm sorry, that's not going to get this in front of employers. Employers are not going to spend time and investment in this and helping you kind of build this product and get it out there because it's morally the right thing to do. I don't disagree that it's morally the right thing to do, but it's a really naive view to say, well, well-being is a moral thing to do, ergo you should do it. Same with diversity and
Mhm.
inclusion. And when I've been open about talking about diversity and inclusion plans in this way, I think I've drawn a bit of criticism again. But but there is enough evidence for you to build a compelling commercial return on investment conversation for most things you want to do in diversity, because diversity is great for our business. And I worry that part of the reason we've seen D&I plans kind of despite what's going on in the US, people have been pretty happy to give up some of this stuff quite quickly, is because people have paid for things that felt like the right thing to do. And in 3 years' time, when budget cuts are starting to happen, the things that can't demonstrate their value are going to be the things you take off the list, right? It's the same thing
Hmm.
you or I would do if we were looking through all of our outgoings and we were making cuts. We would be doing a cost benefit analysis for every line on our bank statement saying, how many times have I watched Netflix in the last week? Is it worth me doing? If it's worth spending this, maybe I should take that off. And that's exactly what
100%.
businesses do. And I think that's quite a sensible approach. But the morality is clouding a lot of these conversations sometimes, I think, especially when it comes to well-being.
So it does bring us on to data, and we've got a couple of bits around data. The role that data plays around sentiment, engagement, well-being, demonstrating ROI, I think that's clear. I think you've just described so much use case for that. Um, if we see data, I'll think about our PX3 model, think, feel, do. So we try and connect the dots between those environmental factors that lead to an outcome. So diversity as an environmental outcome, belonging as a, sorry, as a environmental area, belonging as a feeling, where what outcomes do they lead to? And some of those outcomes are motivation, some of them is a retention, some of those are things. But what we also see is line manager capability, line manager capacity are environmental areas that get cut, budgets get cut on line manager training, on line manager recruitment. But we see, and we show this in our data, that line manager data, when you've got line managers in place who are capable and competent, and they treat people with respect, people are more likely to feel they belong, they're more likely to stay. So line manager capability in our world, our data shows that number one, it is a diversity and inclusion measure.
Yeah.
Number two, it is not just about engagement stats, but it's also about productivity, change resilience, change readiness, and well-being. When I'm backed up by my manager, I feel capable and competent myself to do this. I trust you as an organization, and I feel I belong.
Yeah. I mean, you look at some of the stuff that you guys do. A low engagement score doesn't mean much to many leaders, right? If you've got an engagement score across the business. But I think if you went and you could show what happens to a sales team when engagement is low, you'll start to see some people's ears prick up. So suddenly that becomes, if you can then start to correlate low engagement with lower sales or lower meetings or opportunities being booked, then suddenly people will start to listen to that. And I think a really good example I've had recently is I do a lot of work around workplace financial well-being with Zealous, a company I'm also Chief Innovation Officer for. And we're talking about financial well-being. There's some fascinating research that came out recently around an employee who drives for a living, who's worried about their finances, is something like 10 times more likely to have a what would be a preventable car accident. And so suddenly, if you take that
Mm.
stat, when you're building a financial well-being strategy and you're going to your logistics manager or your health and safety officer and saying, look, I want to do this over here and I want your buy-in because actually I can demonstrate that if I can get these figures up, if I can get that financial well-being level up, you might see more preventable accidents or less accidents taking place in your organization, then suddenly that's far more compelling to them, which is we're looking at financial well-being and they just shrug their shoulders like, what's in it for me? And you'll find in most cases you can find with a bit of work, you can find this evidence, and people are generally quite wowed by it. And it's been particularly powerful in me trying to get employers to do stuff that I think is the right thing for them to do by supporting them with this, using
Do
data
the
to
work.
build that evidence base. Yeah.
It goes back to that, do the work. And I think if you're a hypercritical person, it's not about correlating just for the sake of correlating. It's about saying it must be a truth that
Yeah,
if my
you
mind
put enough
isn't,
stuff together, right? And you can then
yeah,
err on the side of this is probably likely to drive that result.
yeah. And then I mean, if I was thinking about building the business case around everything you just said, and where would I go? Like, this isn't about picking up the phone to Gethin because he's already done it, because that's just me parrot fashioning what you got. And some of that would be great, by the way. I'm going to come and steal some of your work. But um, if I do the work myself, right? If I'm in HR or I'm a person working with HR or a company working with HR now, do the work. It's if you can think about the scenario that says, surely, when somebody's mind isn't on their job, then they can't be as productive. If I
Yeah.
can think about a time myself when I've been worried about my finances or I've been worried about my health, am I 100% productive for 100% of the time that I am working? And the answer has to be no. Okay, therefore, there must be some research that can back that up. Let me now go and find my friend Google, look at ResearchGate, do the work,
Yeah.
build the business case.
Yeah, the research stuff doesn't come easy to lots of people, but the evidence is out there, and I certainly think if you're trying to buy from a provider like PX Hub or Benefex, we will be more than happy to help you build that business
Mhm.
case, and we will have the evidence, and we'll be able to say, look, this is what we did for somebody else that might get it through your board. Lean on those providers. You know, we want you to be successful with us as much as you want to buy our products. So we will help you to get to that point. So any good provider will be able to give you that support.
I love that. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. In terms of common mistakes, in terms of measuring impact of tech or wellbeing programs, what's tripping companies up right now?
I think as we've kind of talked about today, they focus too small. They look at how, I mean, if you look at tech, HR tech in particular, you know, they'll look at how does that improve their own team, you know, that admin reduction contact center calls, higher engagement in whatever the thing is. But I think linking that purchase more widely to other and I would say maybe more important measures is kind of really key here. Um, I mentioned benefits a lot because I'm in that space. I've done all that research over the last couple of months and presented that in Silicon Valley, and that got a good reception. So that's kind of in my head now as this is a really strong example. And so if I just look at what I've prepared for employee benefits and benefits tech, in the benefits world at the moment, when we're working with employers to measure the impact of their benefits tech, typically a lot of the historic narrative around running global benefits tech is focused on two broadly similar themes. And they're the same themes that for almost 20 years have been used to create a business case for benefits and benefits tech. The first one is that we try to look at how does this deliver better outcomes for employees? So how do we meet their needs, support their well-being, all that kind of stuff. And the second thing is how do we deliver better outcomes for the reward and compensation or benefit team? So that streamlined administration, cost efficiencies, consistent delivery of benefits, enhanced data compliance, all that kind of stuff. But I think there's a third, and the third is the more important reason, I think, because we should be applying that kind of thinking to any HR tech or well-being purchase to create a more compelling ROI. And that is how the technology itself, the benefits technology itself, drives improvements in the organization as a whole. The first two are really extremely important, will no doubt be part of the ROI, but that third factor I think is really compelling and often missing from the conversation. Um,
Mm.
and the more I support employers who create an ROI or business case that is built around things that happen outside of the HR function, the more likely I'm seeing that they're getting signed off. Linking to other discussions we've had today, if you are buying People Experience Hub survey, for example, you're not just looking at how you measure engagement or well-being. Your business case could be showing about how asking employees their views, how prioritizing employee voice in this way leads to better outcomes for your stakeholders. And so a survey becomes a way of reducing turnover and absence, like we talked about, but it also becomes a way of driving innovation in the organization, improving customer success levels, improving customer loyalty, enhancing collaboration across the organization. You can show how a survey makes frontline services improve, how it helps salespeople to sell more. And that's a far more compelling business case in my view.
And it makes sense because people are people and they are going to sit and say things like, and I work for an organization that cares enough to ask my view and act on it and to respond by implementing well-being initiatives, employee benefits, communication tools. I feel listened to, feel seen, and my world has improved. When I can see all of that connecting, this is an organization I feel is investing in me. And it's not investing in me in terms of like I've doubled my salary. It's investing in me to ensure that they're looking out for me. And that comes back to you. And I think like you've spoken so much about creating a world of good, and purpose-driven cultures and organizations. And you've talked about how that links through to profitability and shareholder return. What what more can you build on that? What more about that connection across all that piece can you build on?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much evidence now that it's fact, right? That the more we take care of people in the organization, the more you do a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today, the more profitable and higher the shareholder return will be for your organization. I think I've probably across the value enhancing HR model, the that I created, the health hexstad and the performance amplification framework. So that's kind of benefits, well-being, and kind of HR, general HR practices. Those three models I've been focusing on the last 12 months, they collectively have probably running close to kind of 300 studies backing them. The two books I've written both have 600-ish studies each kind of quoted in them or informed in their creation. How much more do I need to give somebody to be able to say, I think this is probably true. If you pull that lever, these things are going to happen. Um, and so I think, a significant contributor to profitability and shareholder return is that great purpose-driven culture. But also, even if you're not working in a commercial business, I can link everything I've talked about today to if you're in an NHS trust, to patient mortality in your NHS
Mhm.
trust, to number of patient falls in your NHS trust, the number of times a patient will fall after they've been discharged from the NHS trust. So the level of post care that they get is determined by levels of employee engagement in those healthcare settings. We can link it to frontline services and councils. I was talking recently to Sir Professor Carrie Cooper about, can we link well-being to things like the number of stop and searches in the police? The police who feel looked after and cared for display less kind of racist attributes and kind of less likely to stop people in the street and all this kind of stuff. And we can start to build this evidence base that's showing the more we do all those things, whether you're generating profit, it doesn't matter whether you're a third sector, if you're a charity that's trying to increase donations. Again, like you said, it all just makes sense. If somebody's shaking a bucket on a high street and they're happy and they're engaged and they feel cared for and they've got as little worries as we can give them in life, they're going to collect more money. It just stands to reason. Somebody overwhelmed by their work situation who feels bullied or pressured is not going to shake that bucket with the same kind of vigor and not come home with the same amount of money as somebody else. So, whatever your measure of success looks like, I would be pretty confident we can link all the stuff we've talked about today to that measure of success.
And it's that, without being all Dirk Gently and Douglas Adams on this, it's very much the interconnectedness of all things as a holistic approach to this that says actually we have multiple nodes. You can't pull on one thing without there being a downstream impact or an upstream impact somewhere else. It's something, whether it's a small, insignificant one or a large impact, there is an impact that you must register. And I think HR, in terms of communicating the value of the work they do and how this translate, I think this is what they have to log this. They have to not just be HR
100%.
KPI driven. You've got to log this stuff. This is how health and safety are working better in our organization, because what we are doing is working with our cross stream providers who look after well-being, safety, and the health of our people. We're working collaboratively. We're bringing the procurement team in to make sure we are working with the best organizations and understanding what we do. The evidence shows us that our workers are X% more productive than the average worker out there, meaning
Yeah.
that we typically can do better because of what we do. So if you are looking to save money and you're looking to cut that Netflix bill, then do we? Yes, we do watch it. Yeah, yes, we are using this. Yes, it does matter to our people. And it links then into that whole frustration of HR, I think, which is I want a seat at the table. I want to be seen as more commercial. I want to be able to do that. Well, this is the business case for you as well. This is the business case for
Yeah.
having that commercial view.
Yeah, and I also think as part of this, HR have to become much, much better at advocating for themselves and leaning into their own experience and celebrating their own successes. Those two sessions I ran with those two big employers last year have been heavily focused on this. We have, again, really heavy evidence, a great study by Salesforce to show that in organizations where HR teams actively communicate their own contributions, that impacts trust, and trust is higher. HR teams who showcase their own achievements and influence within the organization gain more credibility and even more influence. That was a study by SHRM in the US. Adobe found that when HR teams have higher visibility, that enables the HR team to play a more strategic role in the organization too. The more likelihood you'll get given a seat at that table because you're demonstrating you're effective. Even when employees see the impact of HR-led initiatives, participation in future ones increase. And HR teams that highlight their own success get higher budgets, and that was an amazing study by McKinsey. So, budgets frequently on the kind of stuff that you produce and Benefix produces, budget is always one of the things that's in the way of getting people to do what they want to do. And the evidence is saying that the more that HR teams highlight their own successes and expertise, the more likely they are to get budgets. And so HR people listening to this have to brag about themselves. They have to practice that outreach. You have to tell the company what you've achieved. If sales are up because you helped recruit some excellent candidates into the sales team, take credit for that. If customer NPS scores go up and so is your employee NPS score, those two things correlate. So take some credit for that. You have to become your own champion. And the more you build this integrity, this kind of strong influence within your organization, the more you present these types of ROIs, people are going to go, right, these guys know what they're talking about. We've seen the impact of everything else they've done. I'm going to give you the
Mhm.
money to do this next thing.
And that bit that you said earlier about, you know, you're buying this or you're doing this for other people is if you can understand your stakeholder interest groups and you can understand the stakeholder interest topics, the things that really are on the front of their mind, mid-mind, that is the focus of that, you're going to make good decisions. We had a fascinating conversation. This was about a year ago. We had a great conversation where we came into our renewal, sat with the HR team. HR director said, we may not have budget this year to renew. We're being asked to really chop back on everything that we do, be real critical. We may not, even the things that we know add real value, like all the work you're doing. So we may have to cut back on this. And we said, we fully understand the budget challenge that you have right now. We'll work with you. We'll understand what we need to do, how we can offer you something different, something smaller, still value adding. We'll work with you to ensure that you can deliver what you've got to do. Following week was a presentation back to their board of their most recent results. The
Mm.
CEO sat there and said, Nick, I just want to say that having worked with you now for 3 years, you have added so much data and insight into our strategy. You have enabled us to think cross-functional. You have enabled us to see data that we wouldn't normally see. And we've been more responsive within our retail teams, more responsive in our logistics teams. And we've been able to make some real strategic changes in the organization. And I said, I love that. It's a shame that you're having to cut back. At which
Yeah.
point they turned around and said, not this,
Yeah.
not this. Like, and then eyes were around the room, and I was going, "Oh, have I just said the wrong thing?" And the eyes around the room, and he just went, "I just want to be really, really clear. If I'm asking people to review your budgets, I mean anything that we're spending money on that's Netflix that we're not watching. I do not mean the things that come in." So, and I suddenly went, and there's a real disconnect there between our core stakeholder in that group,
Yeah.
plus their
100%.
CEO, their stakeholder expectations and interest and topic interests.
Yeah.
So there's a real disconnect. So my other thing I'd probably throw into that mix is get connected to your most influential stakeholders, as in most influential, as in they have influence on what you do, and also the most impactful stakeholders, the people who are out there delivering safety, well-being, productivity, performance, customer, patient, resident, whatever it is, and work out what's important.
Yeah, I mean, we've had it over the years, many, many years ago. I remember the first time it happened, the CEO of a large house builder in the UK wanted to meet me because the HR team were not making a good job of explaining this. And they were like, if we bring you in and you're an external person with a profile who's written books and won awards, you could say the same thing as we are, but we think it's going to resonate. We're like, okay, if we can support, let's do that. We did that and it did. And what happened is they decided they wanted to not take something that I thought they would. And I sat in front of them and I said, personally, professionally, I think you're making a terrible mistake, and I hope it's okay for me to say that. And I think I've explained why. And then apparently they basically said when I left the room, they were like, okay, well, this guy very confidently said we shouldn't be doing this, so maybe we shouldn't be doing this, and let's keep it similar to what you've had. Just today, I had a message to one of the customers I work with. one of the largest grocery chains in the UK. Can you present to our board and our CEO about what we're doing and why it's the right decision? Because we heard you speak at an event and we think our board need to hear what you've got to say about this stuff. Now that is
Brilliant.
music to my ears. A little bit scary because it now means my influence is moving away from HR to the highest levels of these organizations. But that must tell people, that must tell you and I and the people listening that there's something in this, right? If people are thinking CEOs at the highest level of the organization, this stuff's going to resonate, then reach out to people like you and me and stuff. Work with Benefex and PX Hub and find the experts and lean on them to help you do it. If we help you, your business to say yes, that benefits us. And not every company is lucky enough to have these influential people working for them. So if they have, lean on them because it's the reason why benefits keep me around. And so like, yeah, lean into it because it's clearly something's working.
Oh yeah, brilliant. And I so agree. So we're gonna I could talk on this I think for another
Yeah.
2 hours, but we are gonna have to close down this podcast. So um I guess two things that I ask everyone, which is obviously we are an employee voice, employee listening company. So thinking about employee voice, how can organizations ensure that the insights they gather from people are actually used to drive ROI and meaningful change?
So in my kind of 10 intentions for people operations teams that I created, my number one thing is you've got to become an advocate of the employee voice. And the questions I ask those teams are, how easily can you find, amplify, and champion the voice of the people? And how do you do that further than it currently is at the moment? How can you get better at listening to your people? How do you narrow the chasm that exists between what employees want and need and what their leaders are saying they believe they want and need? And how do you actively listen more? Um, I think this is how you should be using data from employee surveys. They tell you so much more than what many just see on face value. So, how can employee surveys show you how your company mission is being held back? Employee engagement is massively impacted by things like mergers. Yeah, how often do we use employee survey data as part of how will we manage that merger or acquisition, or to use as a temperature check for how well a new leader is doing or a change process? So it's the number one thing that I put on those intentions. It's also the reason why you're in both of my books is because it's an important part of well-being and the employee experience. So you're not going to be able to use data from those employee surveys unless you work with a provider like the PX Hub where you get really compelling data. And as you and I have spoken about before, it's not just about data. It's not just about data arranged in a nice way. It's data that helps you to build a narrative to tell you what's going on in your organization. That's a really important part of building that ROI as well.
Amazing. And final question, what would be the big takeaway from everything you've talked about today? Something someone could just do tomorrow to start building a more people-centric, ROI-driven strategy?
Um, Half of HR leaders say they don't feel their input is valued in their organization, and most wish they had a bigger influence. Um, in my experience and in the research, HR teams with an active outreach strategy where they're going proactively to those stakeholders are more likely to be seen as strategic partners by the entire organization. Um, we've got some great study. Josh Burton Company did a 85,000 global HR professionals, and they looked at managers who engage frequently with HR have higher performing teams. Managers who collaborate more regularly with HR have more inclusive teams. Managers who seek support from HR have higher performing teams. We can track the regularity of HR meetings with managers to higher team productivity. Managers who are close to HR on a regular basis also report higher levels of employee satisfaction with their own leadership and performance. HR visibility could be linked to some of the most significant parts of high performing organizations, but it's up to you to go and do that, right? So become a
Mhm.
champion for what you're doing, celebrate your successes. When you build that compelling business case and it works, make sure everyone knows about it. And yeah, just become better at advocating for yourselves. I think take it from someone who's who's become my own biggest champion online. Yeah, it's part of your success, I think.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Walk the floor, be seen, see your people, understand them, and shout about what you do. That's
Yeah, and
brilliant. Thank you so much.
forget a HR strategy. Your strategy is what everyone else's strategy is. Just use
Yeah,
that as a template and build your HR strategy around that.
I think it's brilliant. I think it is brilliant. Be seen and like you be a servant leader, be a servant department. I think there's
Yeah.
so much in that. Amazing. So thank you so much for joining me for this. This is going to be going out on our season two, which will be released. Well, whoever's listened to this has already been released, but it's going out on our season two. And I've been delighted to have so many amazing people joining, and always delighted for you to join as well. So thank you so much, Gethin. And that's a wrap.